Boris Johnson has won the leadership contest of the UK's Conservative Party and was named the new British Prime Minister. The latest occupant of 10 Downing Street has an urgent task, which is to succeed where Theresa May failed and deliver Britain's departure from the EU. At the same time, tensions are deepening to a dangerous level with Iran, and the US-British special relationship is in the midst of a turbulent period. Can Boris Johnson deliver a Brexit as he promised, with either a new deal or no deal? And how will he manage the situation with Iran and try to smooth things over on the international front? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined by Claire Pearson, former chair of British Chamber of Commerce in China, Cui Hongjian, director of the Department for European Studies at China Institute of International Studies, which will also cross over with Steve King, honorary professor from University College London. He's currently in Amsterdam, and Phil Ryan, deputy political editor of the Irish Independent in Dublin. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, Claire and Hongjian. New era, new leadership, but we have two Boris Yeltsin and Boris Johnson. Are the two guys equally attractive for you? And what do you think of the charisma?
Well, certainly there's no lack of charisma there, but what about the content?
Substance over style, first of all.
Well, I think Boris, he's got some style, some people would say. Has he got the substance? Will he deliver? He's said he's going to deliver on 3 major areas. I was thinking, where is Boris going to go for inspiration? I think he's a massive fan of Winston Churchill, and I'm sure last night he's been reading up on, you know, Winston's speeches: fight them on the beaches, fight them in the streets, fight them in the fields, we will never surrender. But he doesn't need to fight. We're not in 1940. He needs to unite them in the country, unite them in Europe, unite them over the Iran issue, unite them over how to deal with China. Boris could be a splittist, or he could be a uniter. I just hope he has the intellectual capacity to be the latter.
Talking about the Winston Churchill, I remember one of his punchlines: one cannot do what he or she likes, but they have to like what they do. So do you think the job is so attractive for Boris Johnson when he is facing so many thorny issues and difficult tasks, if not a mission impossible concerning Brexit by the end of October?
I think we need to find out, firstly, a very distinctive personality for Mr. Johnson. Even we can find out a very long story for him, even from university, from college, and also as a journalist. But I think now, certainly, Mr. Johnson is a very, very ambitious figure, political figure, and even he tried to follow some, you know, like Winston Churchill and some other great politicians in the history of UK. But another question is opportunity or not for him? I think now he regarded himself as a very, very special person. But now the question is, if the, you know, the time, or if the British people will give him this chance. Because now, as we know, once there is a no-deal Brexit, once there is a snap election, maybe Mr. Johnson will be the one of the you know, prime minister in British history to take the shortest time on the seat. But of course, on the other side, perhaps he will be successful as the prime minister to help Britain get out from the trap of the Brexit.
No one knows what's going to happen in the foreseeable future. Let me cross over to our two guest speakers who are standing by in European cities. Let me first of all go to Phil Ryan. In my living memory, we've had prime ministers ranging from Lady Thatcher to John Major, Tony Blair, and David Cameron. Now, Theresa May, by the way. Now, Boris Johnson. What do you make of his leadership?
His leadership, I suppose, hasn't started very far, so we don't know too much about him just yet.
He was the mayor of London.
In Dublin,
he was the mayor of London.
Well, in London, and I think charisma was brought up so far, and he does have charisma by the bundles. People seem to take to him. They like that he's a little bit bit of a buffoon in some ways. He's not as scared to say what he thinks. People, one characteristic that's needed in a leader who is to be successful is that people are very forgiving of Boris Johnson when he gets involved in any sorts of scandal, or if he gets into if there was some of the things that Boris Johnson has gotten involved in throughout his political career, if it was done to another politician who was not Boris Johnson, their careers would be over. But somehow Boris just bundles on, and people forgive him and like him and like his comments. But here in Dublin, I think that people have been used to, in any negotiations, you get the measure of someone over a number of years, and the Irish government has been dealing with Theresa May and her ministers and her advisors, and they got the measure of them, and they understood, and they had developed a good working relationship, despite what you might have read in some of the British newspapers. There was a good relationship there on working on the Brexit matters, and they got the withdrawal agreement for Brexit drafted up. But now they're dealing with a brand new, someone completely different, someone who prides themselves on being disruptive. And I think they're a little bit in the dark at the moment over here as to which way negotiations will go.
Steve, do you think Mr. Boris Johnson will go down history as one of the most controversial prime ministers in the history of Britain since the end of the Second World War?
Yes.
Oh, he'll certainly be controversial. That's his entire style, and in that sense he's very similar to Trump. Whether he's successful is another story again. And on the leadership issue, one thing which I've noted in the press is that the closer people have been to experiencing Johnson, the less they like him, which implies to me that he'd be very successful at getting popular following with using his charisma, and maybe we'll use that for a national election. But in terms of what his working relationships are like, particularly people on the same side of politics, they seem to be extremely poor. 3 ministers apparently have already resigned because he won the leadership. So it's going to be a very fraught campaign, and he'll be relying upon the same thing that Trump does, which is the capacity to take the crowd with him while not having any supporters close up.
Well, certainly the Chinese viewers will be much more fascinated with the hairstyle of Boris Johnson more than the substance of his policy options. But having said this, the latest Brexit deadline is October the 31st, Claire, which gives the new British government just over 3 months to achieve what Theresa May failed to do in 3 years. What do you think of the adversity of this task?
Well, actually, it's not 3 months. If it comes down to working days, it is 18 days. Britain isn't as hard-working as China. People tend to take August off. So there's going to be 18 days in which he has to deliver Brexit. Now, if anyone can do it, it's bombastic Boris. He doesn't care. He will just go ahead and try and drive that through. I don't think he's worried about the collateral. So, yeah, I think Boris will try and push it through. It's a fact.
Will we have a no-deal Brexit?
Now, I think even now, Johnson claimed that he will try to help UK leave from EU before the deadline, even at the press of the no deal. But I think so far, according to my understanding about his personality, I think mostly it's a kind of a tactical by Johnson to throw the pressure in the court of the European Union, because as we know now there is a deadline, and also there is also the it's a very little possibility to reopen the negotiation. I think now it's a skill for Mr. Johnson to try to exchange, say that okay, if you don't want a no-deal Brexit, please give us the opportunity of reopening the negotiation.
Given the scathing division of the United Kingdom at this moment, it seems strong leadership is badly needed at this defining moment about the prospects of UK that leaves the continent of Europe behind. Therefore, Brexiteers claim, Philip, that if London took a harder line and threatened to leave the EU without a deal, Brussels would be scared into backing down. But is there any possibility, Phil, that the EU will give a new Prime Minister any meaningful concessions?
Well, the no-deal Brexit, the threat of a no-deal Brexit is always a negotiating tool for these talks. And And when the British team went into these negotiations, that was the threat they always wanted to hang over the Brussels side and say, look, you guys need to help us out here. You need to kind of make some, you need to show some leniency around the Irish border. You need to show some leniency around customs arrangements, and allow us, because if you don't, we're going to cause all sorts of economic catastrophe for you and the rest of the continent. But at the same time, there seems to be lost in this debate that a no-deal Brexit is just as bad, if not worse, for the people of England. And it's hard to imagine what type of government would be forgiven for self-inflicting that type of economic disaster upon its people, which will see thousands upon thousands of jobs lost. It will see inflation go through the floor. It's the idea that people's lives are being used as a bargaining tool like this. It is really deplorable. And I think earlier, I think it was Claire discussed about how Boris Johnson sees himself as a Winston Churchill in these times, but he's not on the beaches of Normandy. These negotiations and these battles, if you want to call them that, will be done in the boardrooms of Whitehall and the boardrooms of Brussels and around other places in Europe. This isn't a fight. This is a negotiation to change basically the structures of how a continent works. It's not a war. And I think that a little bit of calmer approach from both sides would be very helpful.
Obviously, this is a matter of nail-biting negotiations between Britain and the European Union. By the way, Philip, very quickly, do you think Ireland, Northern Ireland, will be very happy to walk away from Great Britain in the aftermath of Brexit?
It's a very tricky question, and it's a debate that needs a long time to go through. We're only 21 years into a peace process which ended violence on this island. And the idea that in the middle of these Brexit negotiations we would move into an equally, if not 100 times more, possibly divisive debate around the 6 counties of Northern Ireland and their place on the entire island of Ireland is not one that I think the people of Ireland as a whole, the entire island, need to have right now.
Mr. Tony Blair, whom I interviewed 3 times, deserves the credit for the peace process with the IRA, by the way. Let me cross over to Steve. Now, Ursula von der Leyen, the incoming EU Commission President and former Secretary of Defense of Germany, said recently that she would extend the Brexit deadline if there are good reasons for doing so. So how sympathetic and accommodating do you expect von der Leyen to be towards the UK?
Oh, not at all. And this has been the entire process, that the European Union was designed to expand, not to contract. Effectively, its clause for exit was rather like an Irish divorce law from 30 years ago, which basically says the only way to get out of the marriage is to die. There's no way they want anybody to leave. That's why they gave Theresa May the runaround, and they'll do exactly the same to Boris. He won't get a new deal. So my feeling is it's going to get to the stage where, since I expect he has to rely upon a vote in Parliament, he won't get a vote in Parliament for either a new, neither he can't raise, nor a no-deal Brexit. So I expect to see elections called and to see in a sense, some form of effective coalition between the Tories, who'll be voting for leave, or putting a leave program forward, and of course the Brexit Party under Nigel Farage. And it's a question then whether they get a majority compared to Labour, which I expect will, under this pressure, go for a Remain situation.
Thank you so much. You are watching Dialogue on the New Leadership in number 10 of Downing Street. I'm happy to be joined here in the Beijing studio by Claire Pearson, former chair of British Chamber of Commerce in China, Cui Hongjian, director of the Department for European Studies at China Institute of International Studies. We are also crossing over with Steve Keen and Phil Ryan. Stay with us. We'll be right back after the short break. Welcome back, Claire. What does the hard Brexit mean for the British economy?
Hard Brexit means a hard time for the people economically. So
does it mean economic recession necessarily?
Recession is going to be a relative term. For the last 3 years, we've had stagnation. You've seen how the value of the pound has dropped. You know how many Chinese people visit the UK because, frankly, it's been on sale since Brexit was announced but not implemented. So we're not in an enviable position now globally. we're looking at recession. I don't think Britain's going to distinguish itself in any particular way with a slowing economy due to Brexit or other geopolitical circumstances. But I think what Boris is going to have to deal with, you have to understand Boris. He's what I'd call Belt and Road Boris. You know, he's a one-man melting pot. He has potential. He is teachable. But the new world superpower, China, has to teach him.
Are you describing the presidency of Donald Trump?
I'm not saying presidency.
He's teachable, he's more presidential.
It looks like I'm describing a naughty dog. But what I'm really saying is, Boris, he doesn't want to be the British Prime Minister. He told us when he was a kid he wanted to be world king. You know, you put it well. This guy isn't slightly ambitious. He's very ambitious. But how far can his ambition take him? When he first went for election at the Oxford Union Debating Society, he was beaten by a grammar school boy, somebody he'd consider his social inferior. And then he realised he had to widen his voter base. Subsequently, when he went to the Munich Defence Summit, he made a joke about liberation. And of course, it was somehow misinterpreted. But what he learned is a sort of Bullington Club public school humour doesn't travel. In the old days, if you wanted to be king of the world, you could be British Prime Minister, you could be US President. But now, you have to be able to have a more cosmopolitan circle than that. If I was to give Boris any advice, it would be to diversify not only his cabinet, but his friendship base. Bring him to Beijing. Just see how he measures up here with the New World Order.
Do you think ambition of being king of the world will cast a shadow on what we call the gunboat policy of the Victoria era? And what do you think of, say, the latest efforts by London to forge a closer relationship with Washington in patrolling the Hormuz Strait? And will that pose a serious threat to the stability of the Middle East again?
Mm-hmm. I think now, yes, maybe it's time for Mr. Johnson to show he has a capability to be, to be maturely with his ambition like that. Yes, I think that now the United States would be one of the priority for Mr. Johnson, not only because of his linkage with the United States, and also because, firstly, now for UK and also for Johnson, he want to get some alternative for Brexit, for the economy of the UK after Brexit. As we know, even before, I mean, during the Theresa May administration, the British government was eagerly to get some more cooperation and more even some negotiation on the FTA with US. And I think now the Johnson will follow the way. He has already expressed he want to have a talk with American about this potential FTA. Another issue, I think, is security. As we know that, I think that Mr. Johnson also follow the way of the Theresa May made a kind of a global Britain, which means that Johnson will try to promote the visibility of the UK in the international affairs. I think the Iranian oil ship is just a case of how could Britain try to showcase its visibility and capability. But the visibility is there, but if there is a capability with a big question mark. But now I think because of top priority for Mr. Johnson is to deal with the Brexit. I think the best way for him is to get back or withdraw from the trouble in Middle East.
Let me go to Philip and Steve on such issues like will Mr. Boris Johnson make a divided London of United Kingdom great again by prioritizing your global stakes, such as in the Middle East, where the UK provokes Iran, the very ambitious Persian state, and by provoking the PRC by addressing the issue of Hong Kong. And now, do you think in doing this, the UK will align itself with the United States to patrol the whole world? Phil, what are your thoughts?
Well, at present, I think Mr. Johnson would be best placed looking after his own internal affairs and and getting his country right and getting his country out of Europe if that's what he wants to do, and getting it out in an orderly fashion. Concentrating on international affairs at the moment I think should be secondary. Obviously Britain plays a big place in the world. It is one of the bigger, larger economies, one of the stronger armies in the world. There are a lot of issues going around the world, but there seems to be, on the American side, under President Trump, at present anyway, some sort of an ambition to align himself with the new regime, more so than with the previous regime. And you would wonder what that will entail, and does that mean that some of the actions, the more aggressive actions, and even if they're just rhetoric from Donald Trump, will they be supported more so by Mr. Johnson? Will he weigh in behind him on the international stage more so now than, say, when Theresa May did?
Steve, what can you tell us about the foreign policy issues that Mr. Boris Johnson faces at this moment?
Well, if you've read any of the reports in the English press over the last couple of days, one of the strongest messages that come through is that when he was foreign minister, he's regarded as one of the worst foreign ministers in history. Tendency to make absolute gaffe statements that ended up having British citizens spend longer times in jail when he's supposed to help them get out of overseas jails. Quite offensive remarks in general, and I don't see any capacity in him to restrain that. And of course, when you have such a degree of conflict now between the Hong Kong populace and mainland China, it's quite possible he could swing in with a Winston Churchill empire attitude about Hong Kong, of course, long after the UK has lost its influence there. So I don't expect him to make that any better. I think he's actually more likely to inflame tensions. The other side, though, in terms of Iran, there's some possibility that his very similar personality to Trump might mean that he can attenuate some of the advice Trump is getting, which is making him so hostile towards Iran. But again, given his volatile personality, I wouldn't want to place a bet on that.
Here is the issue of the rights of UK citizens living in other EU nations, Philip. And those of the more than 3 million EU citizens living in Britain are one of the thorniest issues of the Brexit negotiators. How do you look at these concerns, Philip?
On the issue of UK citizens living in Europe and EU citizens living in the UK, I think that was one of the first issues that they tried to compromise on, and I think there won't be one of the thorny issues, let's say. I think there's an understanding on both sides that that's not something you want to play hardball with, that if people are living in certain countries, they're there, they have family ties there, they have extended family there, and I don't think you will see a scenario where people are being rounded up and kicked out of the UK or kicked out of Europe or any part of Europe, or the European Union rather, for that, because like I said, it goes beyond politics. I think that side of things, where you'll see more of a change eventually, presumably, is the free movement of people into the UK, and obviously the free movement of people out of the UK into the European Union. That's where it'll get a little bit more tricky.
Thank you very much. Claire, what do you make of the issue of free movement of labour forces across the English Channel between the UK and the European Union, continental Europe?
It's absolutely critical to the success of the economy that free movement of people is something that is maintained. Businesses cannot, I mean, the thing that is so good about London is that 51% of the people there don't look like me. This is its strength. It is fully multicultural, fully integrated, and therefore fully competitive in a global economy. No man is an island anymore. And if Boris doesn't own his cosmopolitan background, the guy's from Russia, the guy's from Turkey, he moved house 32 times in the first 14 years of his life. He was born in the US. He has got to step up to the mark and make sure Britain remains cosmopolitan and remains competitive by maintaining free movement of people. The hardest working people in Britain are generally the most recent migrants to the country, because they appreciate the easy life people have in the UK.
Aging population remains one of the tough issues for many countries, even including China, in the foreseeable future. What do you think of this flow of labour force between Britain and European Union, and the prospects of fixing this problem the easiest way? Do we have any easy solution?
We need to understand now the demographic situation in London and also in UK. Also, comparing with other European countries, indeed, Britain is a rather younger, country or nation state because of a lot of migration. And so now it will give a very big problem once it is a no-deal Brexit, is how could we keep the free movement of labor force and personnel. But of course, now the question is also we know most of these people who vote for left from European Union is they don't like the migration from other European countries, especially from some Central and Eastern European countries. So I think now it gives a very, conflicting and questions to the decision makers in UK is how could you keep the balance is on one side that UK still need a lot of labor force from other European countries, but at the same time how could you deal with some maybe nationalist local feeling from the people. But of course I think now once there will be some more precarious British economy, I think for the new government, for the Mr. Johnson, he should try to convince the British people that the migration would be part of the British people, and their contribution would be a part of the British economy. But of course, at the same time, I think the British government need to develop a more, a better, mechanism to deal with, especially in the field of social security and some, for example, also health care and some.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let me go back to Steve. Hong Jian was talking about the results of the referendum that led to the Brexit discussions in the UK and the very hard negotiations between London and Brussels. Were such a referendum to be held in the UK about whether the outgoing British ambassador to Washington should be kept there, we're going to see a very dramatic breakthroughs. Perhaps most of them would be very supportive of Mr. Kim Darroch to be the British ambassador despite strong dissatisfaction from President Trump over allegations on leaks of the cable from British Foreign Office. So what do you think of the future of the British ambassador? What will Mr. Boris Johnson do?
Oh, well, I think he'll certainly appoint a new ambassador. That was quite a gaffe. It's a good question as who actually leaked the emails, and one never knows. Normally this sort of thing would be ignored by a normal president. Of course, it wasn't ignored by Trump because his ego is both so powerful and so fragile at the same time. I don't think Boris will want to do anything to annoy Trump. I think he wants to be partnership with Trump in many ways. Certainly in terms of image, they're very, very similar. So I can see him appointing a new ambassador who is from a similar political camp to himself and to Trump.
Claire, do you agree that the British ambassador will definitely be replaced by Boris Johnson, who doesn't want to be viewed by President Trump as unfriendly?
Oh, definitely. He'll put somebody with his political perspective in DC. Yeah, I can see Boris will do that. I mean, one thing about Boris and Trump, Steve Bannon said it, we're living in a media age. Boris and Trump are the result of a Twitter, Instagram generation. They reach the people quickly, they're elected, and they're going to be an interesting combination.
Thank you so much. That's the end of this dialogue on the new leadership of Great Britain. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.